Y'all have a seat. Who knew that in August of 1991, Salt and Pepper would be writing the intro to my message today? For those who are not familiar, let me bring you up to speed. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Not really you and me, but you know what I'm saying. It's in the song. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk about sex for now to the people at home and in the crowd. Who knew? This is good. It keeps coming up anyhow. Don't be coy, avoid, or make void the topic, because that ain't going to stop it. Now we talk about sex on the radio and video shows. Many will know that anything goes. Let's tell it how it is and how it could be, how it was, and of course, how it should be. Let's talk about sex, baby. Anybody want to sing that for us? Oh, okay. Okay. I can't see who said yes, but you're a lucky man, you know? I don't know. Yeah. So a few weeks ago, we said, hey, this is what we're going to do. We planted a church here in Noonan in January 2018. And since then, we've never done a series specifically geared towards marriage. And to be transparent with you, it's been because there's a lot of folks, our demographics, a lot of single folks that are recently divorced, or long-time divorced, or widowed. And it doesn't apply to every single person in the room when we have a conversation about it. And so that's why we've talked about relationships that apply both to, this is just the way you treat people, and this also is very healthy in relationships and marriage. There's been moments in particular talks or sermons, messages, whatever you want to call them, where I've said, hey, now let me talk to the married folks, and I would talk to them for a few minutes. But other than that, we've just completely avoided it. However, over the last 6 to 8 months, there's been an enormous increase of conversations that I've had with folks in our community whose marriages are suffering. And so we just decided, you know what? That's important enough for us to say, hey, we're going to give 4 weeks to it. 4 weeks to the 4 biggest relationship killers. Now with that, we said we wanted to have a template and a foundation. We want to have a foundation that we begin every one of these talks on. And we find that in a really incredible description of a healthy marriage that's given to us by a church planter by the name of Paul. And Paul gives us this this description of a healthy marriage. And what we find in it, and we've started it every single one of our talks with this reminder that, hey, from this, that's where we're moving on to tackle this issue. So I want to read it to you again, even though I've read it to you for the first 2 weeks. I will say this, if you have been here for the first 2 weeks, or you've been watching online for the first 2 weeks, you already know what I'm about to ask you to remember. There are 4 key words in this description of a healthy marriage that's the key, the secret to every marriage. There's 4 of them, 4 key words. Now, if you haven't been with us the last 2 weeks, you listen and you see if you can find out the 4 words, and of course I'm going to tell them to you pretty quickly as soon as I wrap up reading it. There's always the risk when I read an enormous passage, and this one's pretty good. I mean, this one's about 12 verses in a row. Because I'm going to look down and I'm going to break eye contact, and you might have the tendency of saying, okay, he's reading. When he's done and tells something funny again, I'll pay attention. Don't do that. Stay locked in. See if you can find the 4 words. If you've heard it before, see if you can remember the 4 words. I'll begin with Ephesians 5:21. This is the description of an incredibly healthy marriage. Paul says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as Christ loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. 4 secrets. 4 secrets to healthy marriage. First one, it's in the first line. Jesus. Well, in this one they say reverence for Christ. Our mission statement ends with, and Jesus is in the lead. And so we want to be asking the question in every area of our life, is Jesus out front, or are we trying to drag Jesus along? Now, the way Jesus works is you can't put a leash on Jesus and say, hey, come with me, Jesus. It doesn't work. He's the Son of God. He doesn't, like, leashes don't fit around his neck kind of thing. And so you try it doesn't work. And so you can invite Jesus to come along, but he's going to say, no, I'm the leader here. You can follow me. And so sometimes we get in our lives where we get so far away, we've got to kind of figure out, well, if we can't Jesus to join us, which you can't, then what you got to do is you got to backtrack and then get wherever Jesus is at and get behind him. That's the way it works. So Jesus is in the lead. That's secret number 1. Secret number 2, submission. We see right at the beginning, submit to one another. And then we see an emphasis in particular, beyond the one another, we see an emphasis towards the woman to submit towards the husband. Which we say, hey, that seems a little imbalanced. Why don't you harp on the man to be just, but you single out women to say, hey, you should be submissive to your husband. He's not an equal opportunity offender here when Paul's talking about this. And then we go on and we have this other opportunity. Word number 3. We got Jesus, submission. Word number 3 is love. Now, in this particular description, it doesn't even talk about how the wife needs to love the husband. It's just, in fact, half of the entire description is all about husbands, love your wives. In fact, if you want to talk about something imbalanced, it's enormously imbalanced to remind the husband, your job is to love the wife. In fact, he just kind of shows us that he thinks men are mostly hard-headed because he says, love your wives. For women, it was just submit to your husbands, and then he was a period, and like they're going to get that. But for husbands, he says, love your wives. They're not going to get that. Love your wives the way Christ loved the church. They're not going to get that either. This is what he did. He just spells it out. Put himself on a cross. He gave himself up for her. Husbands, have you ever had those thoughts of letting go some dreams? Letting go some opportunities? Letting go an advancement? Because you realize that time with your wife was more important? And then sometimes we make those decisions at the beginning, and then as it goes, we begin to resent her for it. You see, he knew that women would have this propensity to struggle with submission. He knew that men would have this propensity to struggle with what love really looks like. 4th key: Jesus, submission, love, respect. Jesus, submission, love, and respect. Now, when you find those 4 keys to a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage, what we find is that there are 4 very specific relationship killers that counteract those 4 secrets. Week 1, we talked about time. And we just nailed down, hey, this is what it looks like to give away time. It's a zero-sum relationship. Every yes to something is a no to something else. So when we talk about the time that we have, when we talk about second jobs and third jobs and extracurricular activities and travel ball and all these things, all of the things that take away from the primary relationship in your life as husband and wife, it's not that those are bad things. It's just you have to realize it's zero sum. When you say yes to one thing, you are saying no to someone else. And there's only so many times during the week you can do that before you begin to draw negatively on that relationship. That's just the way it is. And everyone is going to be different. Everyone has different jobs and different requirements and different all those things. But time is a relationship killer. The second relationship killer. After that, money. Money. We talked last week. It can make you miserable or it can make it memorable. And it has nothing to do with the amount that you have on which way it goes. Money. Week 3. Let's talk about sex. a relationship killer. Now, when we look at what sex is portrayed in our world today, it's magical, it's alluring, it's seductive, mysterious, exciting. In our reality, at home, after you put the kids to bed, it's none of those things. It's almost as bad as doing the dishes. You're doing it wrong. I wasn't talking from personal experience, Brady. This is going to be good. Occasionally it's what was mentioned above. But so many times I sit with folks and they don't use those words to describe it. They use things that remind us of it being an instrument for punishment. I'm not talking about you 50 Shades of Grey people, nothing like that. I'm not talking about that. Only the people that read it laughed. Guilty twice. But it's the lack of it. It's the we'll just ignore one another. Or maybe it's a tool for persuasion. If you do this, then we can do this. Or maybe it's a reward. Good boy. You know? Or maybe it's hush money. Just shut up about it. And this creates a problem. This creates a problem in our world, and it's really simple. You're not having enough sex. Hands down. You're not having enough sex. Now here's the truth. I have never, not one single time, ever sat with a couple whose marriage was in crisis and they were having all the sex they wanted. Not once. Now, I'm sure there's an exception. There's probably people out there that have sat with them and they're like, hey, when they come in, they're like, yeah, we get it all the time. Like on that, we are just like that plus 10. You know what I'm saying? It just never happened. Now, I haven't met with everybody in the world. I haven't. I'll be honest with you. But I've never had a couple come in and say, you know what? Our sex life is incredible, but I want a divorce. Now, what I have had is I've had someone come in and say, hey, I'm having plenty of sex, but it's not with my wife. Or it's not with my husband. So we come to a place. We have to ask the question. If this is a relationship killer, does God have anything to weigh in on it? Does he have anything to say? Is there anyone that was in the first century that helped watch what Jesus did and how Jesus launched the church? Is there anyone that has anything to say about this? Well, there's this one particular city. It was the city of Corinth. Corinth was a city that was founded by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. It was a Roman colony. It was a place of port and trade. All kind of cultures came and mixed here. In this particular city, there was a Greek goddess of love and beauty. And there's a temple that celebrated this Greek goddess. And there was 1,000 sacred prostitutes that would go to work day in and day out and make themselves available to be worshiped with. And so y'all decided to come to church this morning, sit in a little, cushy chair, sing a little bit. We'll take communion a little bit, listen a little bit, have some ice cream afterwards a little bit, and you'll go home. Well, when they went to church, they went in and they got their groove on. You know what I'm saying? They were just to the wall, from the window, and everything else in between, you know? However you wanted it, whenever you wanted it. And that's the way they did it. And that was the way they worshiped. In fact, if you wanted to go church twice in a day, you can go to church twice in a day. Sunday night, Wednesday night, Sunday afternoon, back for lunch. And you can start your day there if you wanted to. Whenever you wanted to, it was open to you. It wasn't just that one particular temple. In this particular city, there were other deities that were portrayed in legend as enjoying sexual pleasure, putting up on display and kind of celebrating adultery, sodomy. In fact, it wouldn't be uncommon at an Athenian home for you to see a statue. You know, in our homes, like when you show up at our house, we got like garden gnomes, things like that, like little concrete frogs and stuff. You know what I'm talking about? At an Athenian home, it wouldn't be uncommon for you to show up, and they would have this concrete pillar. And on the top of this concrete pillar would be the head of Hermes. And then the concrete pillar wouldn't be a body. It's just a concrete pillar. And this head of Hermes would stand there. But there would be an erect penis sticking out of the front of it. And that would just be at the front of people's houses. And sometimes there'd be a bird, like a concrete bird, sitting on top of it. Right? It was everywhere. They had parades where the central piece of the parade and the procession were figures of penises. In fact, you could go and watch whatever kind of sex show you wanted, whenever you wanted. Guys, girls, flip-flop, animals, anything. It was all on the table for your consumption. In fact, if you do research on first century Corinth, you will find that Las Vegas, on its worst night of the year, in the seediest parts of that town, don't even come close to midday afternoon on a Tuesday. So when we ask the question, or we wrestle with the idea of, does the Bible have anything to say to our culture, to our city? Because it's an archaic book that has really traditional values that just doesn't understand our current culture today. If you do a little research, you find that we've actually come a long way, and we're a little tamer, which I know for some parents in the room, that's hard to believe. So we want to open up, and we want to ask a couple really difficult questions. You know, it just so happens that Paul plants a church in this city of Corinth. And he eventually leaves and he goes and continues his work elsewhere. And so they begin to write him back, and they're asking him a series of questions. So you can imagine a brand new church is planted in like this sexualized culture. And so they're struggling because now they're beginning to see the way that Jesus sees the rest of the world. And they're beginning to filter their behaviors and their thought patterns through the way that they've learned to filter their behaviors and thought patterns through the way that Jesus wants them to. And so they're struggling. They see the culture that they're in, the city that they're in, and they're just not sure. They're just not sure what to do. And so they write him a list of questions, not just about sex, but sex just happens to be one of those things that they ask him about. Because what had happened, one of the issues that were happening, is that people came in and said, hey, you know what? The sexualized culture that we're in is killing us. Like, it's ruining us. It's ruining families, all these things. And so they decided, some of them decided, hey, we're not going to have sex at all. Like, no sex, it's just off the table. That's what's killing us. We're going to stop. We're going to stop that. And so people were asking, is that what we should do? Because it was for sure solving the problem of all the promiscuity that was happening. Like, it was solving that problem, but it was creating other problems as well. And so that was one of the questions he asked. Paul responds to those questions in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 1. We get a hint of what that, we don't have the list of questions, we have the answers to those questions. So we can kind of infer what the question was. This is where he begins answering that particular question. In verse 1, we'll put it on the screen. Now for the matters that you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. So he begins with the exact opposite of what I just said, right? He says, hey, now for matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And so what he's saying there, and let's make sure we get it down, is if you decide to say, you know what, I'm going to be abstinent, I'm going to be celibate for the rest of my life. He said, hey, don't hate on people for that. If someone decides this is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, right, then that's okay. It is good for them to do that. That is a good thing. But notice he's not talking to husbands and wives. He says a man and a woman. He leaves the husband and wives piece out of it because he follows that up in the next verse. He says in verse 2, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. Notice that he said own in it. O-W-E. Like you only get one. Yours, and that's it. Sex has been happening for a long time. And what they're trying to figure out is, how do we do this God's way? That's what this city's trying to figure out. That's what this church is trying to figure out. How do we do this God's way? And I think when we begin to look here, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 and 2, we see a number of things. We see it laid out very simply, and it's just simple as this. God has designed sex. He designed the how, the who, and the when. And we see it in those first two verses. We see the how and the who and the when. We don't see the how. I mean, he doesn't explain how to have sex. I don't know if any of you need to know how to have sex. We can put video, and we don't have a video, but you know what I'm saying? Like we could get some fifth grade like sex education. I don't think we need to do that. So the how is taken care of, I think. But he talks about the who and the when. You're like, well, he didn't give a timetable in there. He didn't say how long you need to wait after you started dating to have sex with one another. No, he didn't put a timetable on it. He put a title on it. Husbands and wives. And he says, well, who should be having sex? Well, the husband with his own wife. And the wife with her own husband. That's who. And so if you ain't one of them, who? And you ain't in that when, he says it's a good idea for you to chill. Now, we continue to look at it. We're just now getting to the hard part. 1 Corinthians 7, 3 and 4. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now, what's interesting, I know you're going to start throwing stuff in a second, but just chill for us just for a minute, and let me get through a couple things, and then you can begin to throw things. At the beginning, let's just make sure, and then we look at the original language. When he used that word, marital duty, the original language has more of a literal sense of you have a debt that's paid, like you owe someone something. So he says, when you decide to get married, then you have said, hey, I want to owe you myself. And on the other side of getting married, she says, hey, I owe you myself. And so you're entering into a contract that says, hey, I owe you me, and you owe me you. That's the contract we're entering into. And so when he says, hey, you should fulfill that duty, it's saying, hey, you have a debt that you willingly want to have. You're saying, I want you to have me. I want you for me to owe you. I want that. I'm inviting that into my life. What's interesting here is that Paul doesn't stress the duty of either partner at the expense of the other. He puts it equal. Now, what's interesting here is if we could go back, we would see that there's an enormous explosion of Christianity. And an enormous piece of that explosion are women. And it's because of some of this type of theology. You see, in the first century, women had no rights. And all of a sudden, you have Jesus and his followers saying, what a man owes is the same thing a woman owes. It's not disproportionate. In that culture, it was whatever a man says goes, the end, period. And then all of a sudden, these Jesus people start saying, no. That women have the same rights to your body, husband, as you have to her body. That when you decide to give her a home, when you decide to say, hey, I want to create this home with her, that you're saying, I want to owe you me as well. The church begins to grow. We see an enormous amount of folks that are latching on to this because it's so different to think that women would have the same rights in this particular day. What we also see is that the verb here, the action word in the sentence, it's in the present imperative, which just means it's a habitual owing. That it's not something that you ever pay off. It just becomes a part of who you are, is the way it's written. And did you also notice that it's significant that he stresses that it's more about the giving than it is the receiving? And that's not really the way we operate, is it? When we talk about sex, it's never about, hey, I'm about to give sex. It's always about, I'm about to have sex. Or if we mess up and we do it in front of our friends, or one of our friends will remind us, you ain't getting none tonight. You know what I'm saying? It's all about getting. But here, Paul begins to rephrase it as something completely different. He says it's not a get or a have thing. It's a give. It's a reminding ourselves that, hey, I decided I want to owe me to you. You know, one of my favorite things that Jason, our community outreach pastor, says in weddings that he does, he says that marriage is thought of as 50-50. But really, it's 100-100. I think that's what Paul's saying here. In other words, I guess if I could put it in a little small, short phrase, it'd be this. Stop having sex with your spouse. Give sex to your spouse. Like, that's got to be the mindset. Stop having sex with yourself. Give sex to your spouse. And then he starts to step on a bunch of people's toes. He says in verse 5, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, when we look at the word deprive, the definition is to deny a person or a place the possession or use of something. So when it says, hey, do not deprive, it says, hey, do not deny each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Now, here's the deal. When I have people come and talk to me about it, a lot of times the first two questions I ask, I talk about time and I talk about sex. Money is always a big deal, and so is the number 4 thing we're going to get to next week. But often those are further down the road. Most of the questions that I have at the very beginning, and this is where we find most of the issues, it's a time issue and it's a sex issue. And it might be because one calls the other one uncalls the other one. One of the two. When we look at this, about this deprive, except for a mutual consent and for a time, I never had anybody say, we're just not having enough sex because we're praying too much. We're just praying all the time. And it's mutual. We talk about it. We decided we're going to just pray. And so we just don't have time to fit into sex. I never had that either. No, when people deprive or deny one another, it's because they're mad. Or because they're disappointed. Or because they had to wash their hair. Or they had a headache. Here's the truth, and this is the hard part for us. All marriage isn't actually marriage. All marriage isn't actually marriage. So the way marriage works, two people, they decide, you know what, let's get married. And so they usually stand up in front of someone like me or a pastor that dresses nicer usually. And they stand there and they give rings to one another and then they exchange vows. And then they kiss and they walk out the door and they have a $20,000 party. Like, that's usually just the way a lot of weddings go. But then there's a different type of marriage where same setting, same party's coming, but the two stand there and they look at one another and they exchange vows, but then they say, there's a third person we want to involve in this, is God. And so we're not just making vows to one another, we're also making vows towards God. And then God is making vows towards them. And so this little triangle here, this relationship vow, this covenant that's entered into, when you do that, you say some different things. You then decide, I actually want to do this marriage thing God's way more than my way. You say, I want Jesus to be in the lead of my marriage. And that's different than when two folks stand together there and they don't include God in it. They're just like, hey, I'm going to give it my best. You give it your best. We'll see how it comes out, you know? When God enters the picture, all of a sudden, that's a choice that every single one of us have the opportunity to make. And so we have some issues with this, though. I mean, even in our culture, there's a phrase that's used for a litany of things, but it's this idea of, well, it's my body, it's my choice. And that is an accurate statement. However, when it comes to what we're talking to in particular, there was a choice that precedes the sex choice, where you said, I'm going to do things God's way. And then that gives me an indicator and a guide of how to make choices going forward. So when I then choose to make a decision about my body, I'm saying, hey, I want to choose what God would choose for my body. Because I've chosen to give God the opportunity to have the most authority in my life. And so then we get back to the idea of, well, how can we say these kind of things? We're saying, hey, I want to choose what Jesus would choose in every one of those situations, that we're not compartmentalizing pieces and parts of our life. But then I also realized there's a really hard question that has to be asked. What if he or she isn't doing other things God's way? Right? Like, are you saying that, hey, that maybe we're having some issues in our sex life, and I should just forget about all the other issues that he or she has? Well, I hope you listen close, and for those of you who are watching at home, kind of lean in with me for a second. If you're in a relationship that's abusive, whether it's physically, emotionally, mentally, then no, I'm not. Sex will not fix those problems. Sex will not help those problems. In fact, it might just make them worse. No, if you're in that kind of relationship, your next step needs to be letting someone know that you're in an abusive relationship. But for those of you who are not in abusive relationships, and by the way, if you are in an abusive relationship, you can tell me. You can tell any one of our volunteers and say, hey, I'm in a relationship that it's not good. And we will do everything we can to help. So if that's not you, though, and you're in a relationship that has the struggles and the ups and downs and the back and forth and the mundane and the day-to-day pieces and all the parts in between, yeah, I think you really need to take a really long look at how this works and how this makes sense and how it applies to where you're at in your particular life. Because the truth is, when we decide to do things God's way, we realize that what could be a relationship killer, and often is, it also can be a relationship giver. It can be a really positive thing. It can be something that transforms and moves and breaks through barriers and places that you're stuck. I think to kind of explain it in a different way, we've read the Bible this morning, and we've talked about what that means specifically. And so I want to draw a line here. And everything forward, the Bible doesn't tell us this. I'm going to tell you what I've learned in my short time as a pastor. I've been doing church work since 2005, so not an extremely long time, right? Not an extremely long time. So I don't claim to know everything. I just want to give you what I've experienced. So we've talked about what the Bible says. Let me share with you what I've learned in my time talking with couples, both healthy and unhealthy. And that's this: sex for men is a catalyst, right? Sex for men is a catalyst. It's a catalyst for making a man feel wanted. It's a catalyst for making a man feel admired. It's a catalyst for making a man feel respected. It's a catalyst for making a man feel loved. A catalyst for making a man feel appreciated. So when sex is absent, that catalyst is absent. I'm going to speak on behalf of all of us men, so I hope I'm not messing up some of you. When that catalyst is absent, we struggle with those feelings. We struggle with being admired or respected. We struggle with feeling like, are we loved? Do they even see us? Is there something wrong with me? Because it's a beginning for us. Now, for women, it's not a catalyst. It's a result. It's a result that they're admired. It's a result of being respected. It's a result of being loved. It's a result of being appreciated. It's a result of being wanted. And so we have, for one of us, it's a beginning. For one, it's like, hey, this is the way we close out things. It's just more proof that God has wired us and created us incredibly unique, that we are different, which means that we've got to then figure out how do we bridge that gap from a catalyst to a result and have some conversations about it so that we understand where we're at and that we can trust one another's conversation. When someone looks at you and just says, I just don't feel wanted, that you can hear that for what it is. And not respond with, well, you shouldn't feel that way because, well, last week I did this and I did this and I did this and this should be it. And all of a sudden you're arguing about something completely different than what the actual issue is. Or on the vice versa, it's, hey, I don't feel like it because I just don't feel like you appreciate what I do around the house. Like you haven't even noticed. And all of a sudden, another argument about something else starts completely different than what you're actually arguing about. When we get the catalyst and result piece, it leaves us with this burning question. If that's the truth, then who goes first? Jesus would say, you do. You go first. And you might be like, well, hold on, but guys or girls? The man or the woman, who's the? You do. You see, for a follower of Jesus, it's never the wrong time to do what Jesus would do. There's never a bad time to do the right thing. There's never a bad time to step in someone's direction. You go first. You start making right what's wrong. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I gave you a homework assignment, and that homework assignment was to create a bucket list, right? You're supposed to create a bucket list and for you and your spouse, and you're going to make this list like you're going to go on a date and do that bucket list. And I got messages all week. It was incredible. I got messages. I got Facebook messages, Instagram messages, emails, text messages, phone calls. I would see people and like, hey, we did our bucket list. Let me tell you what's on it. I mean, it was incredible. Like some of y'all have some just crazy, ridiculous, mesmerizing ideas, right? Just like, yeah, I want that on my bucket list too, right? I don't want your text messages about how many times you have sex this week, okay? Like, that's not what I'm looking for. Okay, I don't need you to send me an emoji of a champagne bottle, pop in. I don't need that. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't need that, you know? I mean, you can, if it helps you in your spiritual walk, that's fine. I mean, it is what it is, but I just don't need it. But here's the truth. Here's the truth. Again, I'm not talking about those of you who are in an abusive relationship and you need to know what your next step is. I've given you your next step. Everyone that's not in one of those relationships, 100% you need to have more sex. You need to have more sex. It can be a relationship killer, or it could be a relationship giver. Let it be a giver. And the way you do that is you become the giver. Not the haver, not the getter, not the taker, the giver.